The letter showed up in a clean, white envelope with the HOA's flashy gold emblem stamped on it. Honestly, I didn't even need to open it to know it was bad news. The HOA only ever sent letters when there was a fine, a complaint, or some absurd new rule meant to make life a little more miserable. But this was something else. The letter said that effective immediately, my HOA dues were going up by 500%. This was to cover necessary community improvements. And if I didn't pay, there would be penalties, liens, and possibly even legal action. I had to read it again just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. 500%. That wasn't an increase, that was flat-out robbery. I marched straight to the HOA office, a little squat building tucked away at the end of the cul-de-sac, and shoved the door open. Sitting behind the desk was the devil herself, Tessa Ellsworth, the president of the HOA. She was in her mid-40s, and her face always looked like she'd been sucking on a lemon. The type of person who got a kick out of making everyone else's life a living hell. She looked up from her computer and gave me a tight, fake smile. "Ah, Mr. Raymond Dawson. I assume you're here about the dues." "Yeah, you're right," I replied, slamming the letter down onto her desk. "What kind of scam is this?" Tessa folded her hands and leaned forward, her smile still plastered on. "It's not a scam, Mr. Dawson. It's necessary. Necessary." I scoffed. "Like what? New landscaping? Repainting the clubhouse? Upgrading the pool?" I cut her off before she could respond. "I don't use the clubhouse. I don't use the pool. And I couldn't care less about what kind of flowers you plant. So why should I pay for it?" Her fake smile stretched wider. "Because that's how an HOA works, Mr. Dawson. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to snap back. I'd lived in this neighborhood for over 10 years. I wasn't about to let some power-hungry bureaucrat push me out of my own home. "You can't just jack up the fees by 500% overnight," I said. "That's extortion." "Oh, but we can," she replied sweetly. "It was voted on by the board." "The board," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. "The same board that's made up of you and your little group of yes-men?" "This isn't over," she chuckled. "I'm sure it's not," I said, turning and storming out of the office. I was seething, but I wasn't going to just roll over and let them get away with this. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, well, I could get just as dirty. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through the HOA's financials. There was no way I was going to sit back and let Tessa get away with her blatant cash grab. If she thought she could bleed the neighborhood dry with no consequences, she had another thing coming. I pulled up the HOA's budget reports for the last few years. As a homeowner, I had the right to access them, though they weren't exactly easy to track down. After a bit of digging, I started to see some oddities. The fees collected didn't match up with the expenses listed. There were vague charges for administrative costs that didn't make sense, and payments to a company called Montgomery Property Management. That name sounded familiar. It didn't take long to put two and two together. The company was owned by none other than Ethan Montgomery. She'd been funneling HOA funds into a business run by her own family. I couldn't help but chuckle. That kind of corruption didn't surprise me one bit. But just exposing her wasn't going to be enough. I wanted her to feel the heat, and I had a plan to make that happen. I made a few calls to some friends who worked in utilities and city planning. After some back and forth, I discovered exactly what I needed. The HOA office's power supply was separate from the rest of the neighborhood. It was on its own grid, tied to a commercial account. And that meant if anyone requested a review of the account due to financial discrepancies, say a fraudulent transfer of funds, it could trigger an automatic suspension of service until the issue was sorted out. I filed the request that evening. The next morning, I drove by the HOA office just in time to see Tessa and her cronies standing outside, staring at the darkened windows. The power had been shut off. No lights, no air conditioning, no computer access. I parked across the street and watched as the confusion quickly turned into panic. Gloria's voice rose in frustration as she barked orders into her phone, but there was nothing she could do. The power company wasn't going to restore service until the financial issues were cleared up, and that could take weeks. Residents started gathering, murmuring among themselves. Word spread fast that the HOA was in deep trouble. A few homeowners came over and asked if I knew what was going on. I played it cool at first, but when I saw the frustration on their faces, I knew it was time to make my move. I pulled out my laptop and showed them everything I had uncovered in the HOA's financial records. The payments to Ethan Montgomery, the unexplained charges, the outrageous dues increase. Everything was right there in black and white. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Angry looks were exchanged. Tessa must have noticed the shift in the air because she stormed over, her face red with rage. She demanded to know if I was responsible for the power outage. I just smiled and handed her a printed copy of what I'd found. She snatched the papers from me and scanned them quickly. Her face went from angry to something else entirely: fear. She had been caught, and she knew it. The homeowners around us weren't just upset anymore. They were furious. Someone suggested calling an emergency vote to remove Tessa and the board. Others pushed for an external audit of the HOA's finances. Just like that, the grip Tessa had held over us for years started to crumble. As more residents joined in, demanding transparency and accountability, I leaned against my car and watched it all unfold, satisfaction settling deep in my chest. Tessa had thought she could squeeze every penny out of us with no consequences. But she'd underestimated the very people she'd been exploiting. Now, standing in the sweltering heat outside her powerless office, she was finally realizing that her reign was over. The crowd outside kept growing as more and more homeowners came over, drawn by the commotion. The murmurs grew louder, and soon, open outrage filled the air as copies of the damning financial records passed from hand to hand. People pointed at the papers, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some shot angry glares at Gloria, their faces tight with fury, while others muttered bitterly about the unexplained fees and arbitrary fines they'd been forced to pay over the years. Gloria's hands shook slightly as she gripped the papers I had handed her, her knuckles turning white. She flipped through the documents, her eyes darting frantically over the numbers and signatures. Sweat beaded on her forehead, though whether it was from the heat or the realization that her little empire was crumbling, I couldn't tell. She stood there frozen for what felt like forever, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, just like that, she snapped out of it and tried to regain control. Her voice rang out over the crowd, sharp and commanding, but there was a hint of desperation beneath the surface. She argued that the documents were being misunderstood, that the payments to her nephew's company were perfectly legitimate, and that the higher dues were necessary for the community's upkeep. She insisted everything had been approved through the proper channels and told people that if they had concerns, they should make an appointment to discuss them privately. That was the last straw. A middle-aged man, a retired contractor named Bill, stepped up from the front of the group. His voice carried weight, the kind earned after years of managing construction crews and negotiating with tough clients. He reminded everyone that homeowners had the right to call for an immediate vote to remove the HOA board if they had evidence of financial mismanagement. He quoted the very bylaws Tessa had used to control us for years, pointing out the clause that allowed residents to demand a special election if enough signatures were gathered. Hope sparked in the eyes of the crowd, quickly replaced by determination. People nodded in agreement, and someone pulled out a clipboard with blank petition forms. Gloria's composure cracked. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her gaze shifted from one homeowner to the next, and I could see the realization hit her that the control she'd held for so long was slipping away. A woman named Megan, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, spoke up. Her voice was steady, unwavering. Megan reminded everyone of the countless times the HOA had handed out unfair fines, enforced rules inconsistently, and ignored complaints from residents who couldn't afford to fight back. She talked about the elderly couple threatened with foreclosure over a small landscaping issue, the single mom harassed for having a child's bike in her driveway, and the veterans who'd been told they couldn't fly the American flag outside their homes. One by one, others added their voices to the growing list of complaints. Tessa took a step back, her carefully crafted authority crumbling. She tried to argue, to insist that the homeowners were being irrational, but the crowd wasn't having it. The petition was filling up with signatures faster than I'd imagined. People were lining up, determined, their faces set. The momentum was unstoppable. Then a low, amused voice cut through the noise. It was a man I'd never seen before, standing toward the back of the group. He was tall, dressed in business casual clothes, and carried a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as an attorney who specialized in HOA litigation. Apparently, one of the homeowners had called him in, suspecting things were about to get ugly. He explained calmly that, with the evidence of financial misconduct, the board could face legal consequences beyond just removal. If the homeowners pursued a lawsuit, they could recover misused funds and possibly dissolve the HOA entirely if corruption was proven. That sent a wave of excitement through the crowd, mixed with righteous anger. Gloria's face went pale. Her fingers clutched the stack of documents, as though they were the only thing holding her up. She stammered something about needing to consult with her legal team, but her words barely registered. The homeowners weren't waiting for her permission anymore. A vote was scheduled for that evening, using the emergency provisions in the bylaws. Volunteers spread the word, knocking on doors and sending out messages to every resident. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the neighborhood had gathered in the park near the now darkened HOA office. A folding table was set up with ballots, and residents cast their votes one by one. Tessa and her cronies stood off to the side, watching helplessly as the tide turned against them. She had ruled with intimidation and red tape for years, but that no longer mattered. When the final count was read, the results were decisive. Tessa and the entire board were out. A cheer erupted from the crowd. People clapped each other on the back, shaking hands and celebrating. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity among the homeowners, a collective relief that the nightmare was over. Tessa didn't wait for the dismissal. She turned and walked away, her shoulders hunched, her face expressionless. No one stopped her. In the days that followed, an audit was launched into the HOA's finances, uncovering even more shady dealings. The attorney helped the homeowners file a lawsuit, and within a few months, the HOA was completely dismantled. With the restrictive rules and outrageous fees gone, the neighborhood thrived. People painted their houses however they wanted, decorated their yards without fear of fines, and finally enjoyed their homes without the constant threat of HOA interference. As for me, I put in a new set of floodlights in my driveway just because I could. And every time I flicked them on, basking in the warm glow of freedom, I couldn't help but think back to the night when the HOA was plunged into darkness. Poetic justice at its finest. In the days following the vote, the neighborhood pulsed with a kind of energy I hadn't seen in years. Neighbors who'd once kept to themselves were suddenly chatting, making plans for improvements that actually mattered to them, and sharing ideas on how to keep the community in good shape, without the iron fist of the HOA. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood like a dark cloud finally dissipated, replaced by a fresh sense of possibility. Of course, Tessa didn't just vanish overnight. Sure, she'd lost her position, but she wasn't the type to just give up. She would fight to get back to the top if she could. I caught glimpses of her a few times, lurking around the neighborhood, whispering with a handful of loyalists still on her side. These were the same folks who had benefited from her time and power, the ones who always seemed to escape fines while the rest of us got buried under them. But they were outnumbered now, and they knew it. The day after the vote, a locksmith showed up to change the locks on the HOA office. We'd hired a temporary committee to secure the records and start the transition. Our attorney suggested we file an injunction to make sure Tessa or any of her old board members couldn't interfere with the finances until a full audit was complete. That afternoon, a process server showed up at Gloria's house to deliver paperwork. At first, she refused to take it, but the law wasn't interested in her pride. The papers were taped to her door, legally served whether she liked it or not. A few days later, I was working in my garage when Bill, the retired contractor, swung by, his grin saying he had news. He wasted no time diving right into it. The audit had uncovered a lot more financial wrongdoing than we had originally thought. The payments to Gloria's nephew's business were just the beginning. There were inflated invoices for landscaping work that had never been done, maintenance charges for non-existent services, and even a shady consulting fee paid to a shell company. One that, when we dug deeper, turned out to be linked to an account in Gloria's name. She'd been skimming money for years, and now the evidence was right there, clear as day. Jack leaned against my garage workbench, shaking his head. The HOA had been sitting on a reserve fund meant for emergencies, but Tessa had nearly drained it with her schemes. And that 500% dues hike? It was never about improving anything. It was just a last-ditch effort to cover up the massive financial hole she dug before anyone noticed. But now, everyone knew the truth. We wasted no time filing a lawsuit against Tessa and the former board members who'd enabled her. Our attorney helped us draft the case, citing fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. The evidence was airtight, and the case moved quickly. As the legal battle played out, the neighborhood started changing. Without the HOA hovering over us, people took pride in their homes again, not because they were scared of fines, but because they wanted to. Yards that had once been forced into a boring uniformity now flourished with personal touches. Driveways were no longer battlegrounds for petty violations. The clubhouse that Tessa had insisted needed expensive renovations? It turned out it was perfectly fine. A few volunteers patched up some small issues, and just like that, it became a usable space again. One evening, as I sat on my porch, soaking in the peaceful hum of a neighborhood that finally felt like home, Megan stopped by with an update. She'd been following the court proceedings closely, and things were looking grim for Gloria. The judge wasn't buying any of her excuses. The lawsuit had uncovered even more damaging information. Not only had she been mismanaging funds, but she'd also been manipulating property values for her own gain and to help her allies. Several homeowners had mysteriously received low appraisals when trying to sell their homes. This had been part of a scheme to allow Gloria's associates to snap up properties at a bargain. The court ordered a forensic accountant to go over every transaction, and by the time they were finished, the estimated damages were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tessa had no way out. A few weeks later, she was formally charged with fraud and financial misconduct. The court froze her assets, and she was forced to give up her house to help cover the restitution. It was sweet justice. She'd spent years using the HOA to control everyone else, and now she was losing everything she'd gained through corruption. The final blow came when her nephew's fraudulent property management company was exposed. He'd been collecting HOA funds for non-existent services, and under the pressure of the law, he turned on Tessa to save himself. His testimony sealed her fate. When the day came for Tessa to move out, the whole neighborhood gathered to watch. She packed up what little she had left into her car, her face blank, empty. There were no farewells, no sympathetic glances, just the quiet satisfaction of a community that had finally taken back its freedom. As her car disappeared down the street, Jack let out a long whistle and turned to me. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "Neither did I replied. With Tessa gone, the lawsuit wrapped up, and the HOA officially dissolved. We were finally free. The neighborhood had endured years of control, but in the end, we'd come out on top. Not just by removing her, but by proving that a community could stand together and take back what was theirs. As I looked around, seeing my neighbors laughing, chatting, and enjoying their homes without fear, I knew one thing for sure. We were never going to let anyone like Tessa rule over us again. With Tessa gone and the HOA gone with her, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. The oppressive weight had lifted, and for the first time in years, people had control over their own homes. Instead of stressing about arbitrary fines and ridiculous rules, neighbors started focusing on making the community better in ways that actually made sense. But even though Tessa was gone, there were still some loose ends to wrap up. The legal battle was over, but the damage she'd caused still needed fixing. Her financial mismanagement had drained our resources, and while we'd gotten some of the stolen funds back through the lawsuit, there was still more to be done. Megan, Bill, and a few other homeowners took the lead in putting together a plan for moving forward. Without an HOA micromanaging everything, We had to figure out how to maintain our shared spaces without falling into the same traps of corruption. Nobody wanted another power-hungry group to take control. A town hall meeting was held at the park, and just about every neighbor showed up. People brought their lawn chairs and coolers, treating the gathering more like a laid-back community event than some stiff, formal meeting. The vibe in the air was one of excitement rather than frustration, a complete 180 from the tense and uncomfortable meetings we had endured under Gloria's leadership. Megan stood at the center, speaking to the crowd while Jack took notes, jotting down suggestions. Folks threw out ideas for keeping the neighborhood in shape, but without bringing back an HOA. Some folks proposed forming a voluntary association with limited, clear duties, while others suggested splitting up the maintenance work and letting those who wanted to pitch in do so. One of the main concerns was about the shared spaces, the clubhouse, the playground, and the little greenbelt that ran through part of the neighborhood. Without an HOA, there was no longer an official budget for upkeep. But rather than getting into a heated debate, people started volunteering their time and resources. A retired landscaper stepped forward and offered to maintain the greenbelt at cost. A group of parents formed a committee to handle repairs on the playground. Even the old clubhouse, once a symbol of HOA overreach, was repurposed as a free-to-use space that anyone could reserve without any hassle. The most surprising part? Everything started running smoother than it ever had under Gloria. Without all the pointless red tape and personal grudges that used to dictate decisions, people actually wanted to help out. Instead of being forced to pay sky-high fees for services they didn't even need, homeowners were able to contribute in ways that made sense for them. As for me, I had my own task at hand. With Gloria's financial wrongdoings finally out in the open, there was still the question of what would happen to her house. The court had seized it to cover part of her restitution, and it was about to be auctioned off. I wasn't interested in buying the place, but I knew someone who might be. A few days before the auction, I met with a local nonprofit that helped veterans and low-income families find affordable housing. After hearing the whole story, they were eager to place a bid. The idea of turning Gloria's old house into a safe space for someone in need was just too perfect to pass up. On auction day, a few of us showed up to watch. Tessa was nowhere to be seen. She'd disappeared after the lawsuit, likely too embarrassed to show her face. Watching her house get sold off felt like the final chapter of her reign. The nonprofit won the bid, and before long, renovations were underway. The house was stripped of all the flashy, unnecessary changes Tessa had made to make herself stand out from everyone else. By the time the work was finished, the house actually looked like a home again, not a monument to corruption. The family that moved in was a young couple with 2 kids, both parents working in public service. They had been struggling to find affordable housing, and thanks to the nonprofit, they finally got the chance they needed. Seeing them settle in, watching their kids ride bikes in the driveway without worrying about some absurd HOA complaint, felt like the ultimate victory. Tessa had spent years trying to impose her vision of how the neighborhood should function, convinced she knew what was best. But in the end, it was the people she tried to control who showed that a community could thrive without her interference. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the rooftops, I realized this battle wasn't just about getting rid of an HOA. It was about proving that people could run things themselves, without greed or power trips messing it all up. And as far as I was concerned, we had won. With Tessa gone and the neighborhood thriving, life settled into a new rhythm, one without the constant pressure of arbitrary rules and pointless fines. People repainted their houses in colors that had once been banned. Families planted whatever they wanted in their yards, and the old clubhouse, once a hollow symbol of HOA control, now buzzed with life as a shared community space. But even though Tessa was gone, the damage she caused didn't just vanish. The audit had uncovered years of financial mismanagement, but there were still issues to deal with. The neighborhood's insurance had lapsed because of unpaid premiums, and some of the vendors Tessa had worked with were now coming forward, claiming they were owed money, many of them probably complicit in her schemes. Megan and Jack worked tirelessly to untangle the mess, but the deeper they dug, the more complicated it became. The records were incomplete, Some invoices looked outright fraudulent, and there were even missing payments for things like streetlight maintenance. It seemed like Tessa had been siphoning money from every possible source, leaving the neighborhood in financial chaos. One evening, as the sun set and the streetlights flickered on, a small group of us gathered at the old clubhouse to go through the remaining financial records. The room still smelled of fresh paint from the recent renovations, and the space, once so formal and stiff, now felt warm and welcoming. Jack ran a hand over his face, exhaustion showing on him. He'd been combing through the papers for hours, double-checking every suspicious transaction. Megan sat across from him, tapping a pen against her notepad. Her brow furrowed as she concentrated. The deeper we got, the more obvious it became that some of the missing money wasn't just mismanagement. It had been funneled into private accounts through fake service charges. Tessa had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, passing them off as necessary repairs or contractor fees. The worst discovery came when we found a stack of documents buried beneath a pile of old meeting notes. They detailed a loan the HOA had taken out 2 years ago, a loan that was still unpaid. The kicker? None of us had ever been told about it. Megan's jaw clenched as she read through the loan terms. It had been taken out under the pretense of community improvements, but the money had never been used for anything that benefited the neighborhood. The interest had been quietly growing, and if we didn't act quickly, the neighborhood could be stuck with the remaining balance. Determined not to let Gloria's mess drag us down, we came up with a plan. We reached out to the lender, explained the situation, and provided proof that the loan had been taken out under fraudulent circumstances. With the case against Tessa still ongoing, we managed to get a freeze on the payments until further investigation. As we worked through the last of the records, a sense of finality began to settle in. This was the last part of Gloria's tangled web, the final remnants of her attempt to control and exploit the neighborhood. Once we sorted this out, there would be nothing left of her influence. A few days later, as the sun rose over the now peaceful streets, Megan and I walked past Gloria's old house, now home to the young family who had moved in. The place looked warm and inviting, a complete contrast to the cold, imposing presence it once had. The neighborhood had found its footing again, not because of rules and regulations, but because the people had come together and made it better, on their own terms. As we stood there, watching the kids play in the yard, it was clear Gloria's reign was finally over, and the neighborhood was free. Thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe